This is part of an ongoing project, quite unrelated to what I do. Normally, to be frank, public architecture is the domain of other people. But this is the second iteration of a paper that I first gave at an architectural history conference 2 years ago, and it will ultimately be for an edited volume on architecture and empire. So I would welcome your comments and feedback as the real historians among you. I'm only a pretend historian as an architectural historian. But as an architectural historian, my emphasis will be on architecture and its interpretation. Just to be forewarned is forearmed, but the paper is really a reflection on the historiography of 18th century architecture, 18th century Irish architecture in British architectural histories. And the specific focus will be on Palladian architecture, which many of you will know is the dominant mode or style of architecture in the 18th century. Palladian from Palladio, Andrea Palladio, the 16th century Renaissance architect, whose measured approach to the classical canon and whose emphasis on a structural rationalism and visual clarity in design appealed to the architects of the early 18th century, and particularly was kind of taken up, embraced by the Whig oligarchy. And that approach countered, of course, the prevalent continental Baroque taste, which was seen to be aligned with absolute monarchy. Slightly out of breath. So, in response to new political jurisdictions and emerging academic positions, post-war historians of 18th century British architecture, led by Rudolf Wittkower and others, abandoned the broad strokes of late 19th century narratives in favour of an increasingly Anglo-centric position, an approach further compounded by an inevitable centre-periphery thesis. But a history of Palladianism with England as its sole fulcrum is undeniably problematic. Given that the representative qualities of the Palladian style have traditionally been associated with the Whig oligarchy and the Hanoverian succession, the singular lack of a paradigmatic public building in London remains a stubborn obstacle for scholarship. And this problem is further aggravated by the existence of superlative examples of Palladian civic architecture at the periphery, not least the much-lauded Parliament House in Dublin of 1728-39, designed by Sir Edward Lovett Pearce. So this paper, this project, argues that the diminishing of Irish Palladianism in British architectural histories generally, and of this building particularly, is a deliberate, or has been a deliberate action designed to retain a position of preeminence for England in the narrative of Anglo-Palladianism and its dissemination from centre to periphery. And although historians of Georgian Britain have customarily, I'm using that term, I probably shouldn't use Georgia anymore, have customarily acclaimed Dublin's Parliament House as, quote, a strikingly original design, or, quote, a masterpiece in the Palladian idiom, this talk, seminar, will demonstrate how its importance has been, by necessity, curtailed in the historiography. It is, after all, I argue, a building that was commissioned by the wrong parliament, in the wrong city, and on the wrong island. Like a fly in the ointment, it upsets established hierarchical narratives that insist on the authority of England and the primacy of English archetypes on architectural culture in the British Atlantic world. So as an interlude, if you like, just to say a little bit about the building. A very complex history, I'm not going to go into it. But its architect, Sir Edward Lovett Pearce, is widely regarded as being perhaps the best informed, architecturally speaking, of his peers, and secured the commission in place of the person who it should have gone to, Thomas Burr, the Surveyor General, architect of the Royal Barracks and the library at Trinity College. But that position he got through some serious political manoeuvring. Pearce jockeyed himself into Parliament and was declared elected as MP for Rat Oath in 1728, and he of course enjoyed the support of William Connolly, one of the most important managers of government business and Speaker of the Irish House of Commons, and so won the, quote, competition for its design. The next thing I suppose to think about is why was it built at this time? And there's a number of, I suppose, political contexts. The Declaratory Act of 1720, which insisted on the right of the British Parliament to make laws governing Ireland, with the British, as opposed to the Irish House of Lords, awarded that jurisdiction. In the architectural histories of this building, the established view really is that this ground edifice was more particularly conceived in response to the Wood's halfpence controversy. In 1722, the British government granted English manufacturer William Wood permission to proceed with a patent to coin more than £100,000 worth of copper halfpence for Ireland. And there was sort of a widespread outrage at this among the establishment and the general populace, and concerned that the copper money would ultimately devalue Irish coinage and damage the local economy, and that in turn Jonathan Swift, unsurprisingly, issued a series of satirical broadsides which rallied public opinion, and the government eventually capitulated. So the affair is thought to have marked the emergence of a strain of Protestant patriotism, one that insisted on the idea of Ireland as an independent and equal kingdom, and hence the building of this magnificent structure. Maurice Craig, writing in 1952, thought it, quote, difficult to think of any other pretext which would have called forth the very latent patriotism of the MPs at College Green. We may suspect that some such feeling of self-assertion was behind the decision to build the Parliament House. And more recently, Christine Casey thinks this interpretation, quote, perhaps too easy and simplistic. But in general, the Parliament House is regarded as a sign of the growing confidence of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy during the course of the 1720s. And although not a fully independent legislature, the Parliament of the Kingdom of Ireland was an established part of the governing process from the 1730s, particularly with voting taxes. So in terms of its form, it has always been admired for its geometrical rigour and its regularity of its intervals and its parts. It's an elevation of great simplicity. There's very little carved ornament on it, which is something that has been remarked since the 1730s. And in fact, just to throw some more jargon in there, it's often regarded as being proto-neoclassical rather than Palladian, particularly because of its use of the orders, the classical columns there, as having both a structural or tectonic function as well as being the principal ornament of the building. So that would be a kind of a neoclassical device, if you like, and equally then it's also admired for the bold chiaroscuro of light and shade that you get with this deep porch. So it's regarded as a very innovative building in response to the classical canon, which was richly eclectic by the early 18th century. And just to give you some idea of the kind of quality of it in terms of architectural connoisseurship, various aspects of the design have been, this sort of motif mongering, as American historians call it, looking for the sources. We can find in Palladia's reconstruction of the Temple of Fortuna Primigenia in Palestrina, up here, this evidence of some kind of idea that might have inspired him. Also Palladio's unbuilt but published design for the Rialto Bridge at Venice in 1570. Again, some of these sort of edicular pedimented openings, and of course the colonnade, and indeed the Villa Sorrego by Palladio in Santa Sofia di Bedemonte. Again, we can see that use of the giant order here, and then this bold three-sided courtyard with this bold quality of light and shade. But we can see, I suppose, generally speaking, that it is a design that is, it's a design that draws on an eclectic range of classical sources, both antique and modern. And Edward MacParland wrote back in the early 90s, quote, nothing in the earlier architecture of Ireland, a country with no counterparts to such luminaries as Inigo Jones, Sir Christopher Wren, Sir John Vanbrugh, or Nicholas Hawksmoor, made the advent of Edward Lovett Pearce predictable. So he's seen as being something that sort of sprang up out of nowhere, and that's, I guess, one interpretation of it. So what I want to do now is to think about this idea of Palladianism on the peripheries. The place of Irish Palladian architecture in British architectural histories is best summarised in terms of its gradual attrition in significance, a position reinforced in the popular imagination by texts aimed at the general reader, such as Robert Taverner's Palladio and Palladianism of 1991, part of the popular World of Art series published by Thames and Hudson, which contains not one single reference to an Irish building. But this was not always the case. As one might expect, early surveys, such as Bannister Fletcher's seminal A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method of 1896, and Reginald Blomfield's 2-volume, A History of Renaissance Architecture in England, 1500 to 1800, published in 1897, understood Irish 18th century architecture as an expression of English sensibilities. So while Fletcher devoted a discrete chapter to Irish architecture of the early Christian and medieval periods, its Renaissance architecture was, quote, included with English architecture of that period. So the architecture that Fletcher deems as being nationally, or having a characteristic of a nation, gets its own chapter, that early Christian corpus of buildings. But its Renaissance architecture, Ireland's Renaissance architecture, forms part of a broader English/British narrative. Moreover, although the Parliament building is in fact ignored in both surveys, Blomfield held that James Gandon's Custom House, begun in 1781, quote, ranks high in the record of the 18th century. In concert with Newgate Prison and Somerset House in London, it represented for Blomfield, quote, the final effort of the 18th century tradition. The three are probably the finest public buildings erected in Great Britain since the time of Sir Christopher Wren. A more integrated approach was advanced in A.E. Richardson's quote, Monumental Classic Architecture in Great Britain and Ireland of 1914, a book concerned with what he described as, quote, the academic aspect of neoclassic architecture. The narrative begins post-Christopher Wren because, as the author states, 1730 represented, quote, the earliest date at which both architects and amateurs sought to interpret the true classic spirit. And this, according to the author, happened under the aegis of Richard Boyle, Earl of Burlington. So the Earl of Burlington, Richard Boyle, is regarded as one of the key figures of Palladian architecture in these islands, and I'll show you a building a little bit later on, but he's really seen as the sort of mastermind of the Palladian stylistic revolution in Britain. Richardson describes how what he terms the Roman Palladian phase of English architecture and how it represented a move towards, quote, the appreciation of monumental qualities. Significantly, Richardson defines monumental architecture as possessing, quote, a simplicity of effect that impresses the mind at once with the greatness of the idea, and that this immutable idea is embodied in the design, quote, irrespective of nationality or period. For Richardson, the first building of importance, that's a quote, to embody these qualities was Dublin's Parliament House. In other words, the first example of Lord Burlington's enlightened classical ideal in the public realm was realised in Dublin. More significantly, its location in Dublin, rather than London, was implicitly or even explicitly immaterial to Richardson's thesis. Formalist concerns clearly override national identities here, a factor no doubt aided by the fact that the building, in the wake of the Act of Union, no longer served its original purpose and had of course been acquired by the Bank of Ireland in 1804. So here, of course, we introduce the political context. While Ireland ceded its sovereignty in 1800 and was incorporated as part of the United Kingdom, a formal separation with Great Britain was, however, anticipated from at least the 1870s, where you might even argue with that. But as Ireland celebrates its decade of centenaries, we're revisiting, I suppose, and re-examining the course of events that led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922 and the subsequent founding of the Republic of Ireland in 1949. But the point here, of course, is that after this period, Ireland's histories, both political and architectural, would be a separate concern, and this is crucial to our narrative as it unfolds. Although writing in the decades that witnessed Ireland's departure from Britain's political jurisdiction, Sir John Summerson's seminal Architecture in Britain, 1530 to 1830, published in 1953, but based on research going back decades earlier, understood Irish Palladianism to be, quote, as intimately joined to the London school as if the Irish Sea were no greater an affair to negotiate than a couple of English counties. On the other hand, we witness in Summerson's text the beginning of the gradual lessening of Irish architecture in the story of British architecture. As political boundaries were drawn between the islands, and indeed on the island itself, so Irish 18th century buildings were awarded subsidiary roles. While acknowledging that Ireland possessed, quote, 2 or 3 at least of the finest monuments in the Palladian style in the British Isles, the chapter on the Palladian movement in Summerson's text is almost exclusively devoted to the English country house and its evolution in the work of Burlington and the architects William Kent and Colin Campbell, the key architects or designers of the Palladian school in England. Buildings designed by Edward Lovett Pearce, described by Summerson as, quote, one of the most interesting figures in the whole Palladian school, are then confined to a chapter that includes, in descending order, the role of books in the dissemination of the style, Palladianism in the provinces, namely Bath and Liverpool, the second generation of Palladian architects, including Isaac Ware, Sir Robert Taylor and James Payne, the development of the villa typology, Palladianism in Scotland, and finally, Palladianism in Ireland. So some of the finest monuments of Palladianism, by Summerson's own estimation, are thus relegated to a supplementary role in his narrative. A more favourable account of the Parliament House is proffered by Dan Cruikshank in his A Guide to the Georgian Buildings of Britain and Ireland of 1985, a book published with the cooperation of the National Trust and the Irish Georgian Society. Cruikshank is unequivocal that early attempts at forming a public architecture in the Palladian idiom in Britain got off to, quote, a bad start. By contrast, he writes, quote, something remarkable had happened in Ireland. And although he does not account for this remarkable event, Cruikshank is clear that Pearce produced a building, quote, of supreme importance. He continues, designed in 1729 by Sir Edward Lovett Pearce, it is the only really major and successful building produced by the Palladian movement in its early phase. Of course, Pearce was not a Palladian in the Burlington mould, but this building, with its gravity, its powerful and classically correct external detailing, and in particular its mighty temple-like portico, is very much in the English Palladian manner. Even if the bold recession of the portico within flanking colonnaded wings is more Van Bruian than Burlingtonian. So this sort of connoisseurial language. But obviously here too we can see the design is damned with faint praise. Pearce was, quote, not a Palladian in the Burlington mould. So despite being, quote, the only really major and successful public building of its type, its significance is reduced. And significant too is the reference to Vanbrugh as the key exponent of the Baroque style, which further diminishes Pearce's exercise in the orthodox Palladian manner. Giles Worsley's Classical Architecture in Britain, the Heroic Age of 1995, although evidently stimulated by the author's, quote, growing dissatisfaction with the conventional view of the period as it has been since the 1950s, and clearly that's a reference to Sir John Summerson, but his book nevertheless remained on familiar terrain. Acknowledging the Anglo-centric nature of British architectural histories generally, a centre-periphery thesis with England as the dominant cultural influence, Worsley did not in fact attempt to complicate this thesis, and his text is correspondingly replete with contradictions. Describing the Dublin Parliament House as, quote, a sophisticated synthesis of classical and Palladian sources, which contemporary English architects would have found hard to match, and, quote, a building which Lord Burlington would have been proud to include in his projected rebuilding of Whitehall, it is nonetheless confined to a chapter entitled Palladianism on the Peripheries. Under Pearce, according to Worsley, quote, Irish architecture had shone forth as being as advanced as anything in England, and considerably more so than anything in Scotland or America. Paradoxically, Worsley was unwilling to consider the Parliament House as a key building in a broader, far-reaching narrative that might have considered Palladianism as part of a wider British phenomenon without a single dominant cultural centre. And this is arguably the crux of the historiographical problem. Style, as the material embodiment of national, political, or cultural identities, is an established trope in architectural histories. And for many scholars, Palladian architecture represents or embodies the Whig oligarchy in Great Britain. And with that in mind, it would appear that historians will not, or perhaps cannot, entertain a history of such a representative architectural style and its reach in colonial and imperial terms if forced to acknowledge that one of its most iconic and representative public buildings was erected on the peripheries. This is surely at the root of Frank Salmon's recent account of William Kent's unrealised designs for a Palladian Parliament House in London, which contains no references, not even a footnote, to the Dublin building, describing how Kent's designs, quote, go to the heart of what might be seen as a problem long latent in the history of British Palladianism, namely the failure of the genre to produce significant public architecture, unquote. Salmon pointedly ignores what we might call the Irish context for the project. And this Irish context might extend to the fact that what Salmon describes as Kent's quote, concept of the barrel vault over an apsidal space, from Palladio's restoration of the Temple of the Sun and Moon in Rome, was the same source cited, and indeed realised, in Pearse's design for the House of Lords in Dublin. With reference to the corpus of designs prepared in response to a 1732 report calling for new accommodation for the London Parliament, Salmon characterises that response, one that solicited proposals from such luminaries as Burlington, William Kent and Nicholas Hawksmoor, as, quote, a sudden rush of enthusiasm in Lord Burlington's programme to beget a national architecture for Britain. But the reason for this sudden rush is not accounted for, and the fact that the Dublin Parliament House had opened for business a year earlier, in 1731, is not entertained as a factor in the big impetus to, quote, beget a national architecture. And this brings us to the question, I suppose, of the familiarity with this Irish building. And Pearse certainly visited London in 1728, which is sort of thought to have consolidated his understanding of the dominant cultural centre. And in the same year, he presented designs to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, John Carteret. So, in fact, Salmon examines William Kent's designs in isolation, if not indeed a vacuum. But context would, of course, moderate the significance of William Kent as an authority in the Palladian idiom, the purpose of an exhibition and an accompanying publication from which Salmon's essay derived. This is an exhibition staged in the Bard Graduate Centre in New York, and then subsequently at the V&A Museum, a big doorstop of a book, full of essays which are attempting to firm William Kent's reputation as the preeminent designer in Georgian Britain. But, as I said, the essay on his unrealised designs for the Parliament building contained not even a single reference to the Irish building. And this omission, this is the last example, was echoed in a recent exhibition at the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, Palladian Design, the Good, the Bad and the Unexpected, which focused predictably on Palladio and the Anglo-Palladian school of architects, but ventured beyond Britain to include buildings from America, Canada, India and Indonesia. Irish Palladian architecture, though entirely omitted from this wide geographical sweep, was represented, if not in fact acknowledged, by the display of Sir Edward Lovett Pearse's annotated edition of Palladio's I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura of 1570. And just give you an example, it's famous for its annotations, where he kind of remarks on the buildings as he encounters them along the Brenta River and as they're published, and the designs are usually more idealised than he finds them in the landscape. And, Pearse is well known for having, for this kind of architectural connoisseurship, unique among his peers in England and Ireland, particularly for the sort of empirical appraisal of the architecture, and particularly for Palladio's designs. The second book of architecture of the four is really devoted to Palladio's designs. But more surprising than the omission of Irish buildings from the entire exhibition is perhaps the description of Pearse as a, quote, distinguished amateur architect in the accompanying catalogue. While the architectural profession was certainly in its infancy in the 18th century, this is not a distinction bestowed upon Sir John Vanbrugh, Lord Burlington or William Kent in that publication, all of whom could also be called amateur architects if we're going down that road. So given the complex cultural and political relationship between Dublin and London, Pearse's Parliament House has generally been regarded as a sign of the confidence of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy during the course of the 1720s, as I noted at the beginning. So the Parliament of the Kingdom of Ireland was an established part of the governing process, largely due to its role in voting taxes. Christine Casey, in her Dublin of 2005, has remarked how the building's, quote, scale and magnificence vividly evoke the confidence and sense of purpose of its members. And it is indeed the cover of her book. And in his recent account of what he calls the city's, quote, meaning-laden urban terrain, that's Protestant Dublin 1660 to 1760 architecture and iconography, Robin Usher has described Pearse's design that, quote, intentionally outshone Westminster and made the government's local outpost, the castle, appear dull and introverted. It was, according to Usher, a building always intended to be showy. And in these evaluations, equating form with identity, Casey and Usher echo the views of Edward MacParland, the foremost historian of 18th century civic architecture, whose seminal Public Architecture in Ireland 1680 to 1760 of 2001 squarely situates Irish Palladianism within its British context. At the outset, it's important to note that MacParland and those before him, like Maurice Craig, do not entertain a case for Irish exceptionalism in architectural design in this period. So, while Craig described Pearse's work as being, quote, closely analogous to that of Lord Burlington, England was, in the more emphatic words of MacParland, quote, the school in which Irish taste was formed. Indeed, Pearse's career has arguably been dogged by such comparisons. MacParland, for example, insists that, quote, the triumph of the Dublin Parliament House, the earliest major public building in the Burlingtonian style in the British Isles, is Pearse's, but that triumph would have been inconceivable without the inspiration of the Apollo of the arts, Apollo being Lord Burlington. So, although, quote, pioneering as a public building in its neo-Palladianism, in a style that was, quote, still radical in Britain, and having no parallel in London in terms of magnitude or political iconography, Pearse's design is described as inconceivable, without Burlington's imprimatur. That said, MacParland is the only author of note to address the explicit bias in these English-authored architectural histories, albeit only in passing. In his Bibliography of Irish Architectural History, published in Irish Historical Studies in 1998, he noted that Albert Richardson's monumental classical architecture and its, quote, integrated view of British and Irish architecture, quote, was then original and still exceptional. That's in 1988. Later in the same publication, he described Summerson's book, which I noted earlier, 1953, as being, quote, insular in contrast with Richardson's survey, so acknowledging that bias, if you like, in the literature. In concert with this thread in Irish scholarship is the persistent notion, however, of Ireland's cultural provincialism. Just as Irish architects were deemed or were indebted to their English counterparts, so their designs are thought to portray their origins on the fringes of metropolitan sophistication. In an essay of 1992, for example, MacParland introduced the idea that Pearse wasn't, quote, impeccably Burlingtonian, describing how the architect, quote, slips the leash in projects such as the obelisk at Stillorgan House for Joshua Allen, 2nd Viscount Allen. For MacParland, this was evidence of the type of eclecticism characteristic of a benign provincialism in Irish Palladianism. As he puts it, quote, beyond the reach of the style police in the real centre of influence, London. But with this in mind, it's interesting to note that English scholarship in the interim has itself challenged the certitude of a doctrinaire Anglo-Palladianism. And there's that building by Lord. This is the sort of canonical Palladian villa in Chiswick by Lord Burlington. So Jane Clark has argued that the arcane Masonic iconography at Burlington's villa in Chiswick signify his sympathies with the Jacobite cause, thus forever dispelling the link with Hanoverianism. More convincingly, Richard Hewling's essay on the architectural ancestry of this building concluded that Burlington's eclectic range of classical sources, antique, Renaissance and Baroque, allowed him, quote, to slip the leash of doctrinaire Burlingtonianism. And in her review of this book, and to the revelations offered by Hewlings in particular, Christine Casey argued that if Burlington's villa was not canonically Palladianism, quote, one wonders if in fact there was a leash at all. Is there in fact an orthodox Palladian style? So while the casualties of Summerson's and Worsley's teleological model of British classicism have long been acknowledged, such as the place of individual architects like James Gibbs who don't fit into that stylistic narrative, it's clear that Ireland is really the principal casualty of this model. It's obviously significant in its corpus of buildings, but it seems to be somehow too embarrassing to acknowledge. It's the kind of elephant in the room. The historical separation of political states and subsequently literatures has fostered a systemic problem in British architectural histories, a problem that is exemplified by the evaluation of Pearse's Parliament House. Dublin clearly preempted London by erecting a monumental public building in the Palladian style, a fact that historians of Palladian architecture in England have yet to adequately address. As we've seen in histories of British architecture, we witness an attrition of significance. At its height, in Richardson's monumental classic architecture of 1914, the Parliament building in Dublin enjoyed a place of unparalleled significance. It is in fact the first building in his book. John Summerson accorded its architect a place in the wider history of Palladian architecture, but the building was relegated to a subplot of that narrative. Giles Worsley diminished the building further still, orienting his history of heroic classicism by necessity towards domestic architecture, principally the country house, while more recently, in Frank Salmon's account of William Kent's designs for a London Parliament House, Pearse and his building, the Irish context, are entirely ignored. Equally, while Edward MacParland notes that the Irish Parliament building introduced, quote, high international classicism to Ireland and was, quote, one of the finest buildings of its time in Europe, his deference to British authority undermines its legitimate claim as, in the words of Christine Casey, quote, arguably the most accomplished set piece in the Palladian style in these islands. So the overriding obstacle to addressing that problem, it seems to me, is that a reversal of influence from Dublin to London, from Edward Lover Pearse to William Kent, cannot be accommodated by histories that advance a centre-periphery thesis. That the idea of Palladianism as a signifier of Anglophone culture and imperialism is not in fact tenable if that culture is not transmitted from the centre of political and cultural preeminence, London. Histories of 18th century Irish architecture have long been mindful of British context for obvious reasons, but the same is not always true of historians of English architecture. Recent accounts of London's townhouses, 18th century townhouses, by Rachel Stewart and Amanda Vickery, for example, consider that city in splendid isolation, an approach that would not be countenanced as prudent on this side of the Irish Sea. If, however, Ireland was to reclaim its place in histories of a wider British architecture, for want of a better phrase, we might avoid the limits imposed by national allegiances and move instead towards an evaluation of the Parliament House as an expression of a recognisable architectural culture that links Dublin with London, like London with Dublin, and the cities of North America. Recent histories of early modern architecture, for example, informed by material culture studies, are keen to demonstrate the shared vocabulary of making and design in both vernacular and academic contexts. Palladian design orthodoxies are no longer seen as fixed and immutable. And in a recent overview of the literature of 18th and 19th century British Atlantic histories, Daniel Maudlin understands transatlantic culture production as, quote, an increasingly complex, multi-layered exchange between Britain and America, not just an outward ripple or a simple two-way process, but one axis of a network of intertrading Atlantic hubs. And in the introduction to Architecture and Urbanism in the British Empire of 2016, editor Alex Bremner describes, quote, the complex and as yet unresolved relationship between the historiography of British architecture on the one hand and of British colonial architecture on the other. And he continues, quote, typically these two subjects have been treated separately, both geographically and historically. But are they separate subjects, or can they be seen as integrated or even indivisible? And, surprise, surprise, although Ireland has been largely overlooked in these recent histories of multi-layered exchange between Britain and its colonies, it's clear that at least one axis of that exchange, namely Ireland's debt to British architectural authority, is already well established in the literature. So to conclude, and I've obviously cut this short just in deference to you, describing the Parliament House in 1780, the authors of Views of the Most Remarkable Public Buildings, Monuments and Other Edifices in the City of Dublin suggested that, quote, upon the whole, prejudice itself must acknowledge that the British Empire, we might have added Europe herself, cannot boast of so spacious and stately a senatorial hall. So, is this a British building? Or can we claim it as an Irish building within a multiple union of identities? That's in quotes. Can it be both British and Irish? And I think something of this complexity is encapsulated in a broadside of 1751, composed by Nicholas Archdale, a member of the Irish Parliament and a staunch defender of Ireland's sovereignty in the face of the proposed union with Great Britain at mid-century. And he wrote, Great Britain may be considered as the mother of many children, and all her colonies settled in America or elsewhere as so many daughters. But Ireland should be looked upon rather as a sister, whom England has taken under her protection on condition she complies with the economy of the family. So as we've seen, Irish architectural historians are adamant that Irish Palladian architecture adopted the family stance. But in an attempt to comply with the family, did the sister, Pierce, unwittingly outshine the matriarch, Burlington? And is it now time that the lady of the house forgave her errant sibling and welcomed her back into the fold?